Thank you, Professor Amarpal Singh, Dean of School of Legal Studies, for your kind words. It's my privilege to deliver the keynote address in this webinar on monetary policy and modern banking to the students of School of Legal Studies, GGS IP New Delhi. I'm delighted to know that Justice Sri Krishna has already spoken to students. Of course, I know his contribution to financial sector reforms. He was a chairman of FSLRC, Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, and my colleagues worked with him. I am equally glad to know that Justice K.G. Balakrishnan, former Chief Justice of India, will be delivering the valedictory address. I will be speaking on monetary macro policy responses to COVID to the students of legal studies today. These are extraordinary times, and extraordinary times require extraordinary policy response. As RBI Governor of India, Shri Shaktikant Das puts it, whatever it takes to deal with the pandemic, we need to. And over the past few weeks, our hopes for systematically flattening the curve, a short duration of this pandemic, and a quick recovery of economic activity, whether it is U-shaped or V-shaped, have all started to fade. We responded to this crisis by announcing a great lockdown strategy, but that has triggered enormous economic disruptions and mounting humanitarian crisis. And evidence is mounting towards a major crisis, a dual crisis like public health crisis and a macrofinancial crisis on both demand and supply conditions. And basically, this is a human tragedy. How central banks can respond to this crisis? One is we can focus on the measures related to economic firefighting. For instance, how to ensure liquidity infusion in the system and how to stabilize the market reactions. Second is medium-term reforms. This crisis is like no other. This macro uncertainty, the macroeconomic uncertainty which we face now, is hard to measure. And before explaining to you about the RBI response to the pandemic, let me explain to you a bit how US Fed Reserve and European Central Bank responded to the crisis. A day back, I was interacting with Professor Janet Yellen, former Federal Reserve Chair of US. I met her in Atlanta last year when I was attending American Economic Association meetings to present my paper, and it's always a learning experience talking to Professor Janet Yellen. In her recent email to me, she mentioned that she's fully supportive of everything Jay Powell, the Fed Reserve Chair, has done. And how US Central Bank has responded to this crisis? By lowering the interest rates to effectively zero, engaging in unlimited asset purchases, and establishing emergency lending facilities to keep the credit flowing to households and business, and in a flexible interest rate regime. That's what they have in US. Such actions are called for by the fact that the unemployment is at the Great Depression levels and the inflation has consistently undershot the Fed's 2% objective for almost a decade and now is under downward pressure. And Professor Yellen also mentioned that the standard monetary policy rules would call for short-term rates of -10 to -20% if that were policy possible, and these actions certainly can fill that gap. Now let's see how European Central Bank has responded. Christine Lagarde, the president of European Central Bank, mentioned that the ECB is determined to use the full potential of their tools within their mandate. And I was listening to the remarks by Isabel Schnabel. She's a member of Executive Board of the European Central Bank. And she was speaking at an online seminar hosted by Florence School of Banking and Finance in Frankfurt. She puts it up front that ECB responded to the crisis by calibrating the PEPP, that is, the Pandemic Emergency Purchasing Program. That's a non-standard monetary policy measure initiated in March 2020 to counter the serious risk to the monetary policy transmission mechanism and the outlook for the European or the euro area posed by the coronavirus pandemic. And this emergency purchase program, the pandemic emergency purchase program, it's a temporary asset purchase program of private and public sector securities. And the overall envelope is of 750 billion euro. And by removing this duration risk from the market, this emergency pandemic package reduced the bond free float ratio, the share of bonds that need to be held by the public and the private sensitive investors relative to the bond supply. And how this crisis permanently shift the economic structures within the country and across countries that remains largely uncertain at this juncture. And it all depends on the nature and severity of the public crisis, that how these economic shifts will be going to happen. And in such an uncertain environment, monetary policy needs to play a proactive stabilizing role. And we need to restore and preserve the economic and the financial conditions that is consistent with the return of inflation to the levels closer to 2%.